And indeed, in one experiment, just to show you, children were met irritated by another child who was misbehaving towards them. And one group of children was encouraged to talk out their anger with a psychologist. Another group of children was encouraged to go into a room and play with swords and guns and to, as it were, behave aggressively. And a third group of children were simply given an explanation for the behaviour of the child who had misbehaved towards them. And they were told things like, well, if this child has had a very, very distressing time before she got here today, she's been really disappointed in something very important that she was expecting, or that the child had been ill, or the child wasn't feeling well. And when they measured the anger levels, it was very clear that those children who had been given an explanation for the other child's unreasonableness, that their anger level was the lowest. Those children who had talked it out and those children who had rehearsed their anger and played angry games, they were by far more angry.
Another myth as a therapist that I come across that's in the psychological community is the idea that suppressed anger actually causes depression, which is clearly not true.
No, it's not true. And in recent times, the US government has commissioned an investigation of all the research studies carried out in relation to depression. And there were over 100,000 studies involved. And they drew up guidelines, clear guidelines as to how depression should be treated on the basis of what techniques actually worked. And getting people in touch with anger was actually contraindicated for helping people with depression. The sorts of things that actually help with depression are cognitive therapy, behaviour therapy, helping people resolve current issues in their relationships, helping a person get more pleasure back into their lives, challenge negative thought patterns. But getting in touch with their anger clearly is not helpful. And indeed, you find that depressed people don't have a problem with anger repression. In fact, it's usually the other way around, that they're actually very frustrated people and very often irritable. And as they come out of their depression, you actually find, contrary to that myth, their anger levels go down.
Joe, what are the main reasons for people expressing an excessive amount of anger?
Well, there are a number of reasons that one can identify, including, for example, some people are control freaks. That is, they like to control people as well as objects. Now, you can control objects to a certain degree, but people, of course, you have to have a relationship with. A relationship involves negotiation, recognizing the other person's rights, recognizing that the other person has choices and can determine their own life. But power control freaks are people who try to impose their will upon other people. And of course, anger is very often the instrument that they use. That's one sort of situation where you see anger. Another sort of situation are the emotional junkies, for want of a better phrase. These are people who rather have an addictive attitude towards life. They feel the meaning of life lies in creating the buzz from life, be it from alcohol or drugs, or be it from excessive shopping or sexuality, or whatever it might be. But again, people can chase the buzz of anger, and it's a way of getting away from frustrations, hassles in daily life. It's a way of relieving their boredom, just getting excited, very, very excited through anger. Some people chase that buzz. Then, of course, there are the people who simply haven't learned an alternative. They haven't actually been taught as they grew up that nature has given us alternatives to becoming excessively angry, in that we have a higher brain, a higher neocortex, with which we can convey our feelings through words and negotiate a resolution of them. And then there are people who are suffering from brain damage or diseases of the limbic system. And curiously enough, if you look at violent criminals in jails, when brain scans have been done, the vast majority of them have sustained some brain damage as a result of their violent lifestyle prior to actually going into jail. So there are
they've been beaten about the head, or
yes, indeed,
or taking too many drugs or whatever.
Yeah.
So what about passive expressions of anger, when people on the surface are behaving oddly, but it doesn't come out in conventional angry scene?
No, that's one of the curious things, isn't it? Some people may not actually recognize that they have a problem with anger, and it's because they are expressing their anger in indirect ways. For example, amongst the sort of things you might come across is a tendency to stockpile resentments for ammunition. And it's only when the person has got, say, 6 or 7 or 8 grievances that they then get angry and start letting it all come out. Or another alternative is going around with a long face or giving somebody the cold shoulder. Being sexually frigid can be a strategy to indirectly express anger. Or indeed malicious gossip, a way of undermining other people's characters rather than coming out and resolving our resentments. We actually take away somebody's character through malicious gossip. Or indeed using headaches or other illnesses to try and manipulate a person into getting our way. And other alternatives are the person who sabotages strategies or other people's plans, but don't actually come out directly and say, that they don't want to do this. But instead they manage always to create some kind of a disaster or to be late for the appointments so that the behaviour they don't want to indulge in can be practiced. And the last alternative I would consider would be dampening feelings with alcohol and food and drugs. Sometimes when we're angry, rather than actually dealing with the anger, we can try and damp it down through excessive use of drugs or indeed food or alcohol. Needless to say, these ways are just as ineffectual as simply becoming excessively angry. We have to look upon our anger, as with any mind-body communication, as a signal to us to tell us that something is wrong in our life, or at least our mind-body is perceiving something to be wrong in our lives.
And of course all those tactics that people employ have the effect very often of making those around them angry.
Exactly. And then the anger becomes the issue instead of what really is the issue. And so nothing gets resolved.
Well, there's two main problems here. One is that we have to deal with our own anger. And of course we've got to be able to deal with the anger expressed by the people around us. And these require different strategies. So what, first of all, should we be looking at when we're dealing with our own anger?
Well, if we recognise that our anger is a signal telling us that our mind-body perceives something to be wrong in our lives, then we need to be aware that the more angry we are, the less likely we are to be able to resolve what is wrong in our lives, because at high arousal levels, our brain's function is grossly inhibited, and we can only think in black and white terms.
In other words, we become more stupid.
We actually become more stupid. So the first thing we need to do is, if we are involved with somebody and we find ourselves getting angry, is to withdraw from the situation and calm ourselves down. And you can do that quite easily. You can say to a person, look, this issue is very important to me, but I'm finding I'm getting very much worked up about it, and I really like to take a little while out just to calm myself down because I want us to deal with this issue. That's a first aid measure that's absolutely vital.
And how long should one take out?
Well, that's the interesting thing. One actually needs to take about 20 minutes out, because although you can calm down the surface of the mind in about 5 minutes, the physiological level of arousal often can take up to 20 minutes to be switched off. And so if you go back into the fray, as it were, within 5 minutes, you could very easily trigger off an even more intense level of anger. And you'd be wondering where it came from. You could be taken by surprise with it. And the reason is the physiology is so highly aroused. So we need to allow sufficient time to calm down. The second thing is that during that time out, we mustn't spend it rehearsing our grievances, because that will keep the physiological arousal going. So we need to do something either to distract ourselves, like do a bit of gardening or a bit of walking, or a bit of reading, something that engages the part of the mind that's non-emotional. Is very good. Alternatively, another real possibility here, and very useful technique, is to do a breathing technique that can actually calm down the physiology. So we need to take the time out. We need to avoid rehearsing our position. And if we can do something to physiologically relax ourselves, these will be essential first-level interventions. You may have heard of the 7-11 technique that we recommend at the European Therapy Studies Institute. The technique of breathing in to a count of 7 and breathing out to a count of 11. This has the merit of strengthening the balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, strengthening the balance and moving it and shifting it towards relaxation. This is because the out-breath stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, the relaxation response, in other words. And to do that for 5 or 10 minutes will have a really good calming down effect. In addition to that, if we are going to resolve issues that we feel strongly about, we have to have effective communication patterns. We have developed a model at ETSI, which we call the life system of effective communication. The L of life, Ivan, stands for how we listen. And the key skill here is active listening. So if you're in a situation where somebody is emotionally highly aroused, the first thing to do, if necessary, bite upon your tongue, but refrain from stating your position and allow the other person the floor to state what they are upset about. And active listening means that you repeat back your understanding of their position before you start stating your position. This has a hugely calming effect upon the other person. and it makes it much more likely that the discussion can proceed in a calm way. So that's what the L stands for. The I of life stands for, if we are going to go into critical mode, that we do so using the word I rather than you. When we go into complaining mode, we usually say something like, "Now, you never do this. You can't be bothered. You are a lazy so-and-so. You're just too selfish." So criticism, we usually begin with you. So if we remember to start off and say I. So what we're seeking here is to report upon how I feel about things. Not about your behaviour, but how I feel about what you do. So I feel upset, the mother might say, after I've tidied up the room and I come in and I find all your ties thrown all over the floor and everywhere is messed up.